The Grand Conclave Station was one of the largest structures ever built in the known galaxy. It floated in the empty space between two stars, spinning slowly, its lights visible from 100,000 kilometers away. Ships from dozens of species docked along its outer rings every day. Traders, diplomats, soldiers dressed in civilian clothes, and observers from 100 different worlds all moved through its wide corridors. The station smelled like recycled air and alien food and the particular kind of tension that only comes when powerful people are gathered in one place. Ambassador Dale Norris had been on the station for less than 6 hours, and he had already counted 3 separate groups of alien delegates who had looked at him and his team the way someone looks at a stray animal that has wandered into a formal dinner. He did not show that he noticed. That was part of the job. Dale was a tall man, lean and quiet, with dark eyes that moved slowly around a room and missed very little. He had spent 20 years in Earth's diplomatic corps, and before that he had served 4 years in the ground forces on a colony world that most people back home had never heard of. He knew how to sit still. He knew how to listen. And he knew, better than most, that the people who talked the loudest in a negotiation were usually the ones who felt the least sure of themselves. Walking beside him through the station's main corridor was Lieutenant Commander Cora Vance. She was shorter than Dale, with close-cut hair and a calm face that rarely changed expression. She was officially listed as his military aide, which was accurate, though it left out a great deal. Cora had a talent for reading people, not just humans but alien species she had studied for years, and Dale trusted her read of a room more than almost anything else. Behind them walked 2 junior staff members carrying cases of documents and data drives. A small security detail followed at a respectful distance. The summit had been called by the Galactic Council, which was the closest thing the known galaxy had to a central governing body. It was made up of 11 senior species, each with a seat on the main council floor, and dozens of junior members with limited voting rights. Humanity had been a junior member for 31 years. 31 years of careful diplomacy, of sending ships that never fired first, of building colonies on worlds no one else wanted, of paying dues in resources and personnel and goodwill. 31 years, and the Council had still never quite looked at humanity as an equal. The official reason for the summit was peace. There had been growing tension along several border zones where human expansion had brushed up against territory claimed by Council-aligned species. 2 incidents in the past year had involved weapons fire, though both had been brief and neither side had pressed the matter publicly. The Council had proposed the summit as a way to settle things before they grew worse. Dale had read the proposal carefully when it arrived. He had read it 3 times, in fact, each time slower than the last. Then he had sat quietly in his office on Earth for a long while before calling his team together. He had not told them what he was thinking. Not yet. He wanted to see the room first. The opening session was held in the Grand Chamber, a vast circular hall with tiered seating that curved up along the walls like the inside of a bowl. The Council delegates sat in the upper tiers. The human delegation was seated at a long table on the main floor, along with delegates from 4 other junior species who had also been called to the summit. Council Speaker Gyrith opened the session. He was tall by the standards of his species, with pale skin that had a faint bluish tint and long fingers that moved constantly as he spoke, a gesture that in his culture signaled authority and calm certainty. His voice was smooth and carried easily across the chamber without the aid of amplification. He spoke for nearly 40 minutes. He talked about the history of the Council, about the great work of maintaining peace across hundreds of worlds, about the responsibility that came with power, and about the generosity that the senior species had always shown toward those still finding their place in the galactic community. He did not once use the word humanity in a sentence that was not also paired with words like guidance, oversight, or assistance. Dale sat through all 40 minutes with his hands folded on the table in front of him. His face did not change. He did not look at Cora, though she sat 2 chairs to his right. He did not look at the junior staff. He looked at Gyrith, and he listened, and he let every word settle into him like sediment dropping to the bottom of still water. When Gyrith finished, a second delegate rose and began to outline the proposed treaty. His name was Mavan, and he represented a species that had been on the Council for over 300 years. He was shorter than Gyrith, broader, with a heavy brow and small eyes that moved quickly. He spoke with the ease of someone who had done this many times before and expected a predictable result. The treaty, he explained, was designed to restore stability to the border zones. It would require human fleets to withdraw from 6 sectors along the outer boundary of human space. It would place limits on new human ship construction for a period of 50 years. And it would require that any further human colony expansion be submitted to a council review board before proceeding. He presented these terms in the same tone someone might use to explain a public transit schedule. Flat. Matter of fact. Already decided. Cora wrote something on the small notepad she kept in front of her. She slid it an inch closer to Dale without looking at him. He did not look at it yet. The session went on for another 2 hours. 3 more council delegates spoke. Each of them added small pieces to the picture, details about timelines and reporting requirements and what the council politely called compliance verification, which meant inspections of human ships and stations by council-appointed teams at times of the council's choosing. Through all of it, Dale Norris said nothing. He asked no questions. He raised no objections. When other junior species at the table made small sounds of concern or sent notes to their own advisors, Dale sat still. This, Cora could see from the corner of her eye, was beginning to unsettle the council delegates. Mavon glanced at Dale twice in the last hour. Gyrith looked at him once, at the end, with an expression that was hard to read but carried the faint shape of confusion. They had expected nervousness. They had expected the small, careful protests of a species that wanted badly to stay in good standing. They had not expected this kind of quiet. When the session ended and the delegates began to move toward the reception hall for the evening gathering, Cora finally leaned toward Dale and spoke in a low voice. "They think your silence means you are comfortable," she said. "I know," Dale said. "Are you going to tell them otherwise?" He picked up her notepad and read what she had written. The note said, "None of them looked at us once when they named the terms. They were not watching for our reaction. They had already decided we would agree." He set the notepad down and straightened his jacket. "Not tonight," he said quietly. "Tonight I am going to send a message home." He walked with her toward the corridor, and his face was calm, and his eyes were clear, and the message he sent to Earth that night contained only one word. Confirmed. The second day of the summit began before the station's lights had cycled to their morning setting. Dale Norris was already awake. He sat in the small common room of the human delegation's assigned quarters, a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside him, a tablet in his hands showing the full text of the proposed treaty. He had been reading it since the early hours. Not skimming it. Reading it, the way he had once been taught to read hostile documents, starting from the back, working forward, paying special attention to the language and subclauses and footnotes where the real meaning of a document usually hid. He was on his 3rd pass when the door to the corridor opened and Ambassador Sarah Holt walked in. Sarah was the second human delegate at the summit, and she had arrived on a separate transport that docked at the station in the middle of the night. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and hair that had gone mostly gray in the last few years. She had spent the better part of 2 decades working in international and interstellar law, and she had a reputation for finding the sentence buried on page 47 that changed the meaning of everything on page 1. She set her travel bag down, looked at the tablet in Dale's hands, and said, "You already found it." "Tell me what you found first," Dale said. Sarah poured herself a coffee, sat across from him, and pulled out her own tablet. She did not waste time. "Section 14, subsection 9, she said. "The relocation clause. It is written in procedural language so dry that most readers will miss what it actually says. But what it says, stripped of the formal phrasing, is that the Council has the right to temporarily relocate human civilian populations from any planet designated as strategically sensitive by a Council review board." She paused. It does not define strategically sensitive. It does not set a limit on how long temporary means. And it does not require the consent of the population being relocated. Dale set his tablet down. "I counted 11 worlds in the current border zones that would fall under that designation immediately." 12, Sarah said. "You missed one of the smaller agricultural colonies in Sector 7. They sat with that for a moment. Cora Vance came in from the side room where she had been working, a thin folder in her hand. She had heard the last part of the exchange and did not need to ask what they were discussing. "There is more," Cora said. She opened the folder and placed it on the table between them. "I went through the ship production limit clause last night. 50 years of restricted construction at the levels they are proposing would leave human defensive capacity at roughly 30% of what it is today by the end of that period. Other species under similar historic restrictions were much larger than us when their restrictions were imposed. We are not. We would not recover from it. Dale looked at the folder. Then he looked at Sarah. Then he looked at the wall for a moment, the way he sometimes did when he was deciding something that did not need much deciding. "This is not a treaty," Sarah said. "No," Dale agreed. "It is a framework for control dressed up in peace language," she said. "They are asking us to sign away the ability to protect ourselves, the ability to grow, and the safety of our own people on their own worlds. And they packaged it in a ceremony with good lighting and formal robes so that refusing it looks like the unreasonable choice." Cora sat down. "The question is what we do in the session today." "The question," Dale said carefully, "is what we do before the session today." He picked up his tablet and pulled up the room layout for the inner chamber, where the second day's closed session would be held. The closed session was a smaller gathering, no observers, no junior species present, just the senior council delegates and the human team. It was supposed to be where the final details were agreed upon before the signing ceremony on day 3. He studied the layout for a moment. "They will present the full document formally this morning," he said. "They will ask for preliminary agreement in principle before the afternoon break. That is the moment they have been building toward since yesterday. Once we give preliminary agreement, the signing tomorrow becomes a formality and backing out becomes an insult to the entire council. So we do not give preliminary agreement," Cora said. "We do not give them anything today that they can use to move us forward," Dale said. "But we also do not show our hand yet. Not this morning." Sarah looked at him steadily. "And the afternoon?" Dale did not answer that directly. Instead he stood, picked up the treaty document, and said, "I am going to ask them one question today. One question, and nothing else. I want to see how they respond to it." The closed session began at mid-morning. The inner chamber was smaller than the grand chamber but no less formal. The walls were lined with the banners of each senior council species. The table was long and dark and polished to a shine that reflected the overhead lights in soft columns. Gyrith opened the session with brief remarks about the importance of the day's discussions. Mavon sat to his right, and Delegate Pruin, who was the one formally presenting the treaty document, sat to his left. Pruin was older than the other two, slower in movement but precise in speech, and he laid the treaty document on the table in front of the human delegation with the careful manner of someone presenting a gift. Pruin walked through the document section by section. He was thorough. He covered the fleet withdrawal terms, the construction limits, the colony review process, and the inspection rights. He did not cover Section 14, subsection 9. He moved past it as though it were a minor administrative item of no particular weight. Dale listened. He did not interrupt. He let Pruin finish and let the silence sit for a moment after. Then he asked his question. "Which council member drafted the relocation clause?" The chamber went quiet in a way that was different from normal quiet. Gyrith's fingers, which had been moving in their usual slow pattern, went still. Mavon's small eyes moved from Dale to Gyrith and back again. Pruin looked down at the document in front of him. No one answered. Dale looked at each of them in turn. He did not press. He did not repeat the question. He simply looked at each face around the table with the same even, patient expression he had worn since the moment he arrived on the station. The silence stretched. Then Gyrith said that perhaps they could move on and return to specific language questions in the afternoon session. Dale nodded once and said nothing more for the rest of the morning. When the session broke for midday and the human team walked back to their quarters, Sarah fell into step beside Dale and spoke quietly. They did not answer. "No," Dale said. "That means at least one of them knows exactly what the clause does and did not want their name attached to it in front of us." "Yes," Dale said. "What does that tell you?" Dale was quiet for a few steps. Then he said, "It tells me they were hoping we would not read it closely enough to ask." Sarah looked straight ahead. "And now that we did?" Dale opened the door to their quarters and held it. "Now we make sure tomorrow goes differently than they planned." The third day of the summit had the feel of a ceremony that had already been decided. The station's lights came up full and bright in the morning cycle, and the corridors were busier than they had been on either of the previous 2 days. Alien delegates moved in groups, speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the section of the station where the human quarters were. There was a current of expectation in the air, the kind that comes when people believe they already know how something is going to end. The signing ceremony was scheduled for the afternoon. General Owen Pratt had been present at the summit since the first day, but he had not spoken a word in any formal session. He was listed officially as a military observer, which gave him a seat at the table but no formal role in the discussions. He was a broad man, quiet and still in the way that only soldiers of long experience ever learn to be, with gray at his temples and hands that rested flat on the table in front of him whenever he sat. The alien delegates had mostly stopped noticing him after the first few hours. He had become part of the furniture. That had suited him fine. The morning session began with Gyrith taking the floor again. He was confident today, more than he had been on either of the previous 2 days. His long fingers moved in smooth arcs as he spoke, and his voice carried the particular warmth of someone who believed the hard part was already behind them. He spoke about what the treaty would mean for the galaxy. He spoke about stability and shared prosperity and the long work of building a community of worlds that could endure for generations. He used the word partnership several times. He talked about what humanity stood to gain, how belonging fully to the galactic community would open trade routes, scientific exchanges, and diplomatic protections that humanity had not yet had full access to. He never once mentioned what humanity stood to lose. Dale sat through the speech the way he had sat through every session since arriving on the station. Still. Quiet. His hands flat on the table. His eyes on Gyrith. Around the table, Mavon was watching Dale with an expression that had changed subtly from the first day. On day 1, Mavon had looked at the human delegation the way someone looks at a thing they have already categorized and put away. Today there was something slightly different in his gaze. Not quite uncertainty, but close to it. When Gyrith finished his speech, he turned his attention to the human delegation with a broad gesture and asked for human confirmation of the treaty terms before the afternoon ceremony. Dale looked at the treaty document on the table in front of him. It was the same copy that had been there since day 2. He had not opened it this morning. He already knew every word of it. He put both hands flat on the cover of the document. He looked around the chamber slowly, taking in every face. The senior delegates. The observers in the upper tier. The administrative staff along the walls. He looked at each of them the way someone looks when they want to make sure they are understood. Then he spoke. His voice was even and unhurried and carried no anger in it at all. He said that the human delegation had come to the Grand Conclave Station in good faith. He said that they had listened carefully to every word spoken over the past 2 days, and that they had read every line of the document placed before them. He said that humanity believed in peace, had always believed in peace, and had spent 31 years working within the framework of this council in the hope of building something real. Then he said that what had been placed on this table was not peace. He said it plainly, without decoration. Not an accusation. A statement. He said that a document that removed humanity's ability to defend its own borders, restricted its ability to grow for half a century, and gave an outside body authority over the movement of human civilians on human worlds was not a peace treaty. He said that humanity had come a very long way to sit at this table, and that they had done so because they believed the conversation would be an honest one. He picked up the treaty document. He slid it back across the table toward Gyrith. Not thrown. Not shoved. Placed, with a steady hand, back where it had come from. He said that he was grateful for the time the council had given, and that he hoped one day there would be a real conversation to be had. Then he stood, buttoned the top button of his jacket, and picked up the single folder he had brought with him that morning. Sarah Holt rose from her chair without a word. She gathered her notes in one smooth motion and tucked them under her arm. She did not look at Mavon. She did not look at Gyrith. She looked straight ahead. Cora Vance stood next. She did not push her chair in. She simply stood, turned away from the table, and faced the door. And then General Owen Pratt stood up. He had not spoken in 3 days. He had not needed to. He stood to his full height, and the sound of his chair sliding back across the polished floor echoed across the chamber in the sudden silence. He buttoned his uniform jacket once and stood straight. He did not speak. He did not need to. The four of them walked to the chamber door together. Dale was at the front. Pratt was at the back. No one in the room moved or spoke. No one called after them. The door opened, and they walked through it, and it closed behind them. For a moment the corridor was quiet. Then, faintly, through the closed door, they could hear the chamber behind them begin to come apart. Voices rose over each other. The smooth certainty of the morning was gone. Jairatha's voice cut through once, sharp and fast, but was quickly buried by others. Mavon said something that came through as noise rather than words. Something fell, a data pad or a cup, and there was a brief scraping sound and then more voices. Cora walked beside Dale and did not look back. "How long before they send someone after us?" she asked. 10 minutes, Sarah said. "Maybe less." "They will not send someone," Dale said. "They will send a message. They will frame it as a procedural matter. An administrative misunderstanding. They will try to reset to day one without admitting that anything significant just happened." "And we respond?" Cora asked. "We board our ship," Dale said, "and we go home." General Pratt, who had said nothing for 3 days, finally spoke. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man used to making himself heard without shouting. "Good," he said. The four of them walked on down the corridor, and the station hummed around them, and somewhere behind them the grand chamber was still in chaos, and ahead of them their ship was waiting, and there was nothing in any of their faces that looked like regret. The door to the council's private strategy room closed, and for a long moment no one inside it said anything. It was a smaller room than the grand chamber, windowless, lit by panels in the ceiling that cast a flat white light over the long table and the 6 people seated around it. There were no banners here, no ceremony, no carefully arranged display of authority. This was the room where the council spoke plainly, or at least as plainly as it ever spoke. Jairatha stood at the head of the table. His fingers, which almost never stopped moving, were still. He had not spoken since entering the room. He was looking at the far wall with an expression that moved through several things quickly and settled on controlled anger, the kind that comes not from being hurt but from being surprised in a way you did not think was possible. Mavon sat near the middle of the table. He had said very little since the walkout. He looked smaller than he usually did, which was a function of posture rather than size. He was leaning forward slightly with his heavy brow drawn down and his eyes on the table surface. At the far end of the table sat Senior Intelligence Advisor Threx. He was not a diplomat. He had never wanted to be one. He was the Council's primary analyst for non-allied species behavior, and he had been on the station for the entire summit as an observer, sitting in the back of rooms and watching and compiling data. He was thin and pale and had the careful, precise manner of someone who had spent a career being right and being ignored. He had a data tablet in front of him. He had been looking at it since before anyone else entered the room. He had not looked up once. Jairatha finally turned from the wall and looked around the table. He spoke in a controlled voice and said that the human walkout was an embarrassment, that it was a diplomatic insult of the highest order, and that the Council could not allow it to stand without a response. He said that 3 fleet units would be redirected toward the human border zones immediately. Not as an act of war. As a reminder. As a demonstration that the Council's patience had limits. Several delegates around the table nodded. This was the expected response. This was the kind of move that had worked before with other junior species who had stepped out of line. Mavon said nothing. He was still looking at the table. Threx had still not looked up from his tablet. Jairatha noticed this and said his name. Threx looked up. His expression was not the expression of someone about to deliver a reassuring update. He said he had been going through intelligence reports. Not the summary reports that came through diplomatic channels, but the raw data from field assets in human space, shipping logs, construction manifests, energy signatures from human shipyards and dry docks, and pattern analysis that his office had been compiling for the better part of 2 years. Jairatha asked what that had to do with the current situation. Threx said it had everything to do with the current situation. He set the tablet flat on the table and turned it so that the others could see the display. On it was a map of the border zones between human space and Council-aligned territory. Along the border, marked in a deep blue color, were fleet positions. There were a great many of them. He explained what the Council intelligence summary had told them going into the summit. Human fleet strength in the border zones had been assessed at moderate levels, consistent with a species that was growing but not yet capable of sustained large-scale conflict. That assessment had been the basis of the entire strategy. If humanity felt isolated and outmatched, the treaty terms could be presented as generous rather than punishing, because the alternative, open confrontation with the Council, would seem unthinkable to them. Then he said that the raw data told a very different story. Over the past 18 months, while the diplomatic groundwork for the summit was being laid, human fleet movements in the border zones had not been the random activity of a species managing its normal operations. The movements had been deliberate, systematic. Human fleets had repositioned into layered defensive formations 3 systems deep along every major approach route from Council space. Not one layer. 3. Gyrith started to say something. Threx continued. Human shipyard output, which Council intelligence had assessed at roughly half capacity based on public trade data and port traffic, was not at half capacity. When his office had gone back through energy consumption records, supply chain data, and the movement of raw materials, the actual output figure was close to full capacity and had been for at least 2 years. The ships they had been building were not appearing in the shipping lanes because they were not going to the shipping lanes. They were going somewhere else. Mavon finally raised his eyes from the table. Threx said that his office had identified vessel signatures in the border zone data that did not match any human class currently in the Council's recognition database. Not upgraded versions of existing ships. New classes. Ships his analysts had no classification for, which meant they had been developed and deployed without ever appearing in any trade or civilian registry. The room was very quiet. Gyrith looked at the map for a long time. Then he said, slowly, that Threx should tell him what the 3 fleet units redirected toward the border would be facing. Threx said he did not have an exact number. He said that was part of the problem. But based on the data available, the human presence along the border zones was substantially larger than anything the Council had planned for when the summit was arranged. He said that the 3 fleet units would not be walking into a situation where their arrival would frighten anyone. He said they would be walking into a situation where they would be watched, calmly, by more human ships than the Council had believed existed. He paused. Then he said the part that sat heaviest in the room. He said that humanity had come to the summit. They had arrived, sat down, listened for 2 full days, asked one precise question, and then walked away without raising their voices. They had not made threats. They had not warned the Council of what was waiting at the border. They had simply left. He said his office still did not have a clear answer to the most important question that raised. Humanity had not needed the treaty. The treaty offered them nothing they required. So why had they come at all? Nobody at the table answered. Mavon looked like a man who was rethinking a very large number of things all at once. Gyrith's fingers had begun to move again, but slowly, without their usual certainty. Outside the strategy room, down a long corridor and through 2 sealed doors, the Grand Conclave station continued its slow rotation between the 2 stars, and somewhere in the middle distance a small human vessel was already moving away from the docking ring and out into open space, unhurried, quiet, and carrying no weapons that were pointed at anything. That, Threx thought as he looked at his tablet, was somehow the most unsettling part of all. The emergency session of the full Galactic Council was called less than 4 hours after the human delegation's ship cleared the station's outer docking ring. Every senior member was present. Several had been pulled from other engagements across the station, and a few had joined by relay link from their own vessels still in transit. The Grand Chamber, which had been set up for a signing ceremony that would now never happen, had been quickly rearranged. The decorative arrangement of flags and formal lighting was gone. The room looked plainer and smaller without it. Gyrith opened the session without ceremony. He gave Threx the floor immediately. Threx stood and delivered his full report, the same material he had presented in the private strategy room but now expanded and detailed for the wider Council body. He spoke without stopping for nearly 30 minutes. He covered the fleet repositioning, the shipyard output data, the unclassified vessel signatures, the layered defensive formations along the border zones. He put every piece of information on the display behind him and walked through it at a pace that was careful and precise and did not soften anything. The chamber was quieter than it had ever been during the summit. When Threx finished, no one spoke for a long moment. A delegate from one of the older Council species finally said, in a careful voice, that if this analysis was accurate, then the treaty terms as written had been based on an entirely wrong understanding of humanity's position. Threx said that was correct. Another delegate said that humanity had sat through 2 full days of negotiations under those terms without once indicating they were aware of the imbalance. Threx said that was also correct, and that he believed it was not an accident. Mavon, who had said very little since the walkout, was sitting near the center of the chamber. He looked like a man in the middle of a very long and uncomfortable thought. He did not contribute to the discussion in the early part of the session. He sat and listened, which was not something that came naturally to him. The conversation moved through several phases over the next 2 hours. There was a phase where some delegates argued that the show of force order should stand, that the 3 fleet units should continue to the border as planned. This argument did not last long. Threx answered every question about it with patient, data-backed responses that made it increasingly clear that this option would accomplish nothing useful and might accomplish something considerably worse. There was a phase where several delegates tried to find an explanation for why humanity had come to the summit at all if they never intended to sign. This discussion went in circles. Various theories were proposed. None of them were satisfying. A few of them, when examined closely, required assuming that humanity had made a series of errors that the behavior of their delegation made extremely unlikely. Then Gyrith said something that changed the texture of the conversation. He said that perhaps the question of why they came was less important than the question of what they were prepared to do next. And that before the council could answer that question, they needed to understand something they had not bothered to understand before coming to the summit. He paused. He said they needed to understand what humanity actually wanted. The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It was the quiet of people hearing something obvious said out loud for the first time. Gyrith asked that a secure communication channel be opened to the human vessel currently in transit. He did not frame it as a demand. He framed it, carefully, as a request. The channel took some time to establish. The human ship was already well clear of the station. When the connection finally came through, Dale Norris appeared on the display at the front of the chamber. He was seated in what appeared to be a small briefing room aboard the ship. He was not in his formal jacket. He looked relaxed but attentive. Gyrith greeted him and said that the council wished to understand the human delegation's perspective on the events of the past 3 days. He said the question was a genuine one. He asked why humanity had come to the summit if they had reservations about the terms. Dale looked at the camera for a moment before answering. He said that humanity had come because they believed in the possibility of a real agreement. He said that Earth had no interest in permanent tension with the council and never had. He said that 31 years of membership in this body had been a genuine effort, not a performance, and that the human delegation had arrived at the Grand Conclave station hoping that what waited for them there was a conversation between equals. He said what they found instead was a document that assumed humanity had no choice but to accept whatever was put in front of them. He said that was not a conversation. And he said that humanity had not traveled across that much space to sit at a table where the outcome was already decided before they walked in the door. Gyrith said that the council had not intended to be dismissive. Dale said, quietly, that intention and effect were different things, and that the document spoke for itself. The channel closed a few minutes later. Not in anger. Calmly, with a mutual acknowledgement that the conversation was not finished, only paused. The council session continued for some time after that. The show of force order was quietly withdrawn. Threx was asked to prepare a fuller analysis for distribution to all council members. Several delegates who had said very little during the summit itself began to speak now, and what they said was more measured than what had been said over the past 3 days. Mavon left the session early. He did not explain why. On the human vessel, moving steadily through the dark between stars, the 4 members of the delegation sat in the ship's common area. Dale had his coffee. Sarah was reviewing notes. General Pratt was reading something on a small device with the focused stillness he brought to everything. Cora was looking out the narrow viewport at the stars. A young aide was also aboard the ship. His name was Ven, and he was attached to a minor council observer delegation that had arranged permission to travel with the human vessel as far as the nearest relay station. He was young by the standards of his species, curious in the way that young people sometimes are before they learn to be careful about what questions they ask out loud. He had been watching the human team for most of the journey with something between fascination and confusion. He finally came and sat near Cora and said, after a moment of gathering himself, that he had a question if she did not mind. She said she did not mind. He said he had been at the summit for all 3 days. He had watched the human delegation sit through terms that were, in his honest assessment, not fair. He had watched them stay calm through all of it. He had watched them walk out without shouting or threatening or appealing to anyone for support. He said he did not understand how they had done any of that without being afraid. Cora was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the stars, at the particular darkness between one system and the next, the kind of distance that used to mean isolation and now just meant home was further than it once had been. Then she turned to look at him. She said that they had been afraid. She said that anyone who told you they had never been afraid was either lying or had never faced anything worth being afraid of. She said fear was not the problem. Fear was just information. What mattered was what you did with it. She said that the human delegation had known before the first session what the terms were likely to be. They had prepared. Not for the summit they hoped to attend, but for every version of it, including the version that turned out to be real. They had read the document. They had understood what was in it. They had made their decision and they had stuck to it. She said that was not the same as not being afraid. Ven sat with that for a while. Outside the viewport the stars moved slowly past, steady and cold and very far apart. Were you ready? He asked, meaning something larger than the summit. Cora looked back out at the dark. We were ready, she said. That is different. The ship moved on through the silence between stars, and behind it the Grand Conclave station grew smaller until it was only a point of light, and then even that was gone.